photograph, I recognize Mr. Percy Hanna, Mr. Leon McKinney, Mr. Cleveland Eneas, and I'm sure persons like Sir Orwell would probably know all of the names of the men in the photograph, and I think also Mr. Peter Cole standing at the back. Now, the People's Penny Savings Bank was eventually taken over by the government and became the forerunner of what is now known as the Bank of the Bahamas. Okay, now we're going to move to the trade union movement. Now, I was alive when Dad did his great exploits, but I just don't know what happened. I have absolutely no recollection of anything that happened so well. My mom and my dad shielded us from what was going on. My earliest recollection of politics would be 1967. I think you would have had to be a stone not to realize that something monumental had happened in the country. So I do remember they were going to meetings on Windsor Park, and going to meetings in the House of Labor, and there was a lady by the name of Sister Florrie Smith, and I remember when Sister Florrie prayed, the walls would shake. But Sir Randol grew up in the Bahamas that had a segregated way of life, and black Bahamians were unable to go to many public places, including major hotels, certain movie houses, certain schools. Black persons were also barred from working in major business establishments, businesses on Bay Street, and in those days they were referred to the Negro workers, as they were called in those days. They were paid a very meager wage. And it was conditions like this that helped to fuel the Burma Road riot, which took place in 1942. And in this next photograph, we see the Duke of Windsor. Yes. There you have a photograph of the Duke of Windsor being sworn in as the governor of the Bahamas. And he was the governor when the Burma Road riots occurred. Very early in his life, Sir Randol made a decision that he was going to cast in his lot with the downtrodden. And among the discoveries that I made in his library after his passing, I found 2 spiral-bound notebooks. And this page that you see in front of you, this was torn out of one of those notebooks. And this entry was written on the 16th of April, 1945. He would have been 21 at that time. And I'm going to read to you what he wrote here when he was 21. I, Randol Fawkes, being of sound mind, do hereby firmly resolve that I shall hereafter let every thought, every act of mine be decided and weighted in the scale of human values, so that whatever I do may benefit not only 1 or 2 individuals, but humanity at large, and I do hereby dedicate my life to the service of the oppressed. God give me the strength strong enough and life long enough to see it through. Signed, Randol Fawkes, and dated April 16, 1945. Now, Sir Randol had quite a liking and an affinity for poor persons. And what I do remember was that when we were growing up, I think we got our first car around 1960. So we walked everywhere. Occasionally we rode in a horse and carriage and sometimes a taxi. And as we walked through the streets, he always greeted everyone, and he referred to everyone, my brother, my sister. I'm so happy to see you. And there was always that firm handshake. And I remember asking him one day, why do you refer to everybody as your brother or your sister? And his answer was, all men are my brothers and my sisters. And when he was interviewed by a journalist in 1998, he stated that his favorite Bible verse was, blessed is the man who helps the poor, for the Lord will be there for him in times of trouble. And that's from Psalm 41. And he was so desirous of helping these poor people that in the early 50s he opened an employment agency and in his office. And to this office came persons desirous of finding employment. So, go forward. Okay, yes. And that's a scene from the House of Labor. And the people loved going to the House of Labor. Dad had a huge following in those days. And people would say, any church tonight? That's how they used them, any church tonight. All right. And so he gathered these people together in various parks. I remember going to a building they referred to as the Bodie Building on Wolf Road. And I remember that building because at that time they didn't have railings around the top veranda, and there was always the fear that we would fall off as we were climbing up the steps. But he had these meetings trying to educate the people. My mom has an expression, she said, that Daddy tried to peel the scales off the eyes of the people. So he tried to educate them about their rights as workers. And here we have Sir Randol making a presentation at the House of Labor on Wolf Road. And he loved this House of Labor. He referred to it as his spiritual home. And he even asked if, before he died, he asked if he could have his funeral at the House of Labor. So he had quite an attachment to this building. And the workers and Dad, they literally built this building themselves, laying the blocks. I remember going there on Sunday, putting those blocks up. And so he urged the people to organize themselves into unions and to unite in order to obtain better wages, better working hours, and conditions of employment. Bread, peace, and freedom. That was the phrase that captured the hopes and aspirations of the people. And in this photograph, we have a picture of a modern-day collective bargaining scene. And Sir Randol, he wanted to avoid acts of violence, riots, and illegal activities. And so his mother opened the door, and the young lady said that she was attending St. John's College. And she asked Mrs. Fawkes, Mrs. Mildred Fawkes, if she would be so kind as to buy some tickets. Apparently they were trying to build classrooms, and they were asking people to help out with the purchasing of blocks for these classrooms. And so, I don't know if my grandmother was a matchmaker, she isn't alive to say, but she summoned my father from upstairs, he was there studying, and asked him to come down and introduced him to, at that time, Jacqueline, a neighbor who had recently moved to Nassau from West End and Bahamas. These are my maternal grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonard George Bethel. And it was in 1946. My grandparents, they had 9 or 10